Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to this next session. So this is going to follow on very nicely from Gabriel's discussion earlier, because what we're going to be talking about now is some of the issues that arise when we try to implement some of the kind of policies that might address health inequalities and issues to do with urban planning, but how we work with communities in a way that we can take those things forward. Just to say that my name is Andy Gibson. I'm an associate professor in public involvement, and I work at the University of West of England. Actually, just before I put the slides up, maybe it's better to do the introductions now, so where people can see you. So, yeah, Jo, I'm going to go to you first.
Hi everybody, I'm Jo White, and I'm a senior research fellow in the public health team at the University of West of England at UWE. And I'm working on the TRUDE project. My responsibilities there, we're involved in doing research to explore ways of involving the public and urban planning more effectively, and also develop creative initiatives with disadvantaged communities in Manchester and Bristol to communicate their own experience to decision makers in order to influence priorities.
Great, thank you, Jo. Kelvin?
Hi, I'm Kelvin Blake. I'm a non-exec director on North Bristol NHS Trust, and I've been a executive director on a number of health trust organisations in Bristol. But more recently, I've been involved with politics for a long time. I've been a local councillor, and I recently ran Marvin Rees's re-election campaign earlier this year, and I ran it in 2016.
Great, thank you, Kelvin. Victoria?
Am I on mute? I don't know. That's great. Hi, I'm Victoria O'Folby. I'm from Manchester. I'm a Manchester resident. I work in creative engagement, and I'm a public contributor on the TRUDE research project.
And thank you, Victoria. And Sian?
Hi, my name's Sian Pick-Jones. I'm a research fellow at the University of Manchester. And my experience is in community and local government engagement, where I've worked in local government as an advisor to central government in the charitable and private sectors. I'm presently working on the TRUDE project as an embedded researcher located in Transport for Greater Manchester and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, where I also did PhD research with GMCA around tackling complex policy problems.
Great. And so, as you can see, I think we're really fortunate to have this panel of people, because I think we've got all the different perspectives that we need to discuss what we're going to discuss today. So that is really great. So I'm just going to share some slides, so just bear with me. So here we go. So can everybody see that? Can someone just say if that can be seen? I hope people can see that. So what I'm going to do then is, so obviously we've just done introductions, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So it's just hesitating on the slides. No, it's not moving on the slides. That's a shame. Let's stop the share. Sorry about that. So I don't know if people could see. Could you see those slides just then? Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to redo it because I couldn't get the slide transition to work. Great. Sorry about that. So what we're going to do today is present a case study, and it's going to be based on some real life events that took place in terms of a consultation that was around creating a low traffic zone. And we really want to do today is discuss the lessons that can be learned from this, and we're going to look at 3 questions. What might be the motivations of different groups in this situation? How can we navigate differences of opinion between different groups and stakeholders, and what are the lessons that need to be learned? And what we'd like to do is we're asking those questions of members of the panel, but we're really keen that you, as the audience, help us answer these questions. And there may well be people here who've got lots of experience of dealing with these kinds of issues. To do that, we're going to use something called Mentimeter, which some of you may know of. It's really easy to do. All you need to do is type menti.com into your browser or your Google search, and it will take you to the Mentimeter log on page, and it will ask you for a code, and the code is 18919285. You just log that in. It will take you straight to a page where you can put your thoughts and comments down. And as we go through the discussion, we'll be just looking at some of those comments. Those comments we'll keep those so we can go back to them after the event. So that will be very helpful. And if you want to get in contact, you can leave your contact details, and we can do that. So yeah. And if you do that log on now, then by the time we come to it, hopefully people will be on and we'll be able to review people's comments and thoughts in answering the questions. So yeah, and like I say, the code 18919285, and I think that's going to be put in the chat as well. So that's great. So just by a bit of context, thinking about air pollution, a lot of the impetus for legislation in this area came from the EU, but it's been incorporated into English legislation through air quality standards. So there are legally binding limits for concentrations of outdoor major pollutants, and local authorities have a responsibility to review their air quality in their area. And if there's a problem, designate an air quality manager area and try and improve that air quality. And then we'll develop an action plan cope with that. So that's a little bit of the background. I think just highlighting the health inequalities issue that was discussed earlier this morning. It's interesting to note that air pollution tends to be much higher in areas of lower economic incomes, but those areas are also the areas that have the lowest ownership of cars. So in many ways, the people who have the least car usage suffer the most from air pollution created by cars and other sources. So this is how health inequalities pan out in this particular case study. But Sian is now going to introduce the case study. So Sian, if you'd like to take over, and I'll do the slides.
Okay, this slide that I put up first is a slide that's used quite often in discussions about health inequalities in Greater Manchester. What it does is it plots over the tram network the different life expectancies in different areas, broken down by men and women. The purple blobs are women's life expectancy, and the blue blobs are male life expectancy. Now, for instance, if you look at the difference between Longworthy and Sale, you'll see that a woman in Sale, life expectancy is 82, whereas a woman living in Longworthy, life expectancy is 74. We know that health inequality in Greater Manchester is a big issue. There's a lot of people trying to develop policy to tackle it. There was a comprehensive study done in relation to the Marmot 10 years on study to look at some detail, and there is a direct correlation between places with high levels of deprivation and poor health inequality, poor life expectancy. But we know that there's potentially things that we can do around transport, and we just wanted to focus this event around some interesting press reports that we'd seen that relate to low traffic neighbourhoods, which are an initiative to try and tackle air pollution, as Andy was just talking about. So we're going to present this case study. It's what we like about it is that we can see similar things happening all over the country. In London at the moment, quite a lot of very similar things going on And so we just want to kind of present a bit of a timeline. We've taken most of this information from the press rather than from council sources to give a bit of an indication as to what people are saying. Do you want to move to the next slide, Andy? Can you do that?
Yeah.
So just kind of in context, traffic on residential roads in the northwest has increased 47% in the last decade, and air quality we know is 3 times over legal limit outside some primary schools. In Manchester, 30% of journeys under 1 kilometre are currently driven, and this is forming part of the focus of strategy across Greater Manchester. Some of you will be aware of the B network and other initiatives, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So first of all, I'll crack on with the case study. So if you go to the next slide, Andy.
Yeah.
So we had a situation here where we had a neighbourhood where there was a history of speeding, of accidents, of poor health inequality. And we had a very active local councillor who'd been trying to secure funding to improve the roads in the neighbourhood. Some serious accidents had taken place, and she was trying to respond to what residents were saying to her. But she was consistently knocked back because the funds weren't available. The Mayor of Greater Manchester instigated a challenge fund, and with that there was an opportunity to bid for projects to increase safe walking and cycling in neighbourhoods. And the particular councillor held an engagement event in her neighbourhood about the bid. Quite a few local residents expressed an interest in working on it. And she said, "I want this to be community led. It's your street, you decide." So a team was assembled around the residents that had expressed an interest, and they were supported by officers and members of Highways Department. The Strategic Transport Authority was supportive. That's TFGM, where I have my embedded research position at the moment. The Walking and Cycling Commissioner was supportive, and the cycling charity Sustrans helped put a bid together to create a fully filtered low traffic neighbourhood. If people don't know what a low traffic neighbourhood is, it's sometimes also called a livable neighbourhood or an active neighbourhood. It's basically where the idea is to increase cycle lanes, put planters, widen pavements, introduce traffic calming measures. In this particular instance, it was mostly planters, such as in that photograph there. Although I don't think that photograph is the area in question. So this bid and this idea was actually won some awards as being a pioneering community-led flagship project, and it appeared to be a model of co-production. But within a year of winning the award, there was fierce opposition to the plans, and there'd been numerous engagement events. There'd been distribution of thousands of flyers, but few local people said they'd never heard of the project. So a map of filters was published based on feedback from the earlier engagement events, and a trial was announced. It wasn't an easy time to deliver the project because of the pandemic, but a certain amount of objection started to make itself known. So could you just go to the next slide? So one of the objectors said that her concern was that the scheme would push traffic out onto her road. She was also worried that people weren't aware of the scheme, that older people who couldn't speak English, weren't aware of the project. Some Facebook groups started, flyers were being printed, translated into different languages, objecting to the scheme. Some of the objections were that the scheme appeared to have been championed by some newcomers who'd moved to the area, as house prices had risen in adjacent areas. Online opposition mounted. There was quite an angry social media campaign. Some pretty nasty language was used against various different people. Councillors were fielding questions online, but perhaps had an uneven understanding of the project and were giving answers. One of the councillors said that their answers were being cross-analysed. And then we got to a point where the project was paused. So if you go to the next slide, Andy.
Yeah.
The council announced that it had ended the partnership, that the trial was being paused, and more engagement would take place. A project coordinator was then appointed. There was some rephasing, there was some reconsultation. About 2/3 of people who answered the consultation were supportive, and there was also more publicity around the fact that this was actually a trial. There was some tweets by the Walking and Cycling Commissioner saying this is just a trial. The trial aspect of it is quite interesting because some work that was done in similar project that happened in Waltham Forest showed that 41% were opposed to the idea before the trial, but research after the trial showed only that went down to 4%. I think this is something that's being used quite often, is just is the idea of using trials for LTNs. But the pressure does continue on local leaders and on council members, that even though it was determined early on in the project that this was a good example of a community-led project, it does seem still to be dividing the community. There has been people have tried to move the planters in the middle of the night. The police have been called. There's been people saying that there was no road closed information. Other people have said that they were really excited about the scheme, but they'd received nasty private messages having expressed support for the scheme. So as we stand at the moment, there is still a lot of resentment, but there's also optimism. The local council is still optimistic. She says she gets emails from both sides, probably more emails in support. People are warming up. She thinks that the picture painted of universal opposition from less affluent families is too simplistic, and says that the picture is more nuanced from the residents that she has contact with. Air quality monitors and traffic counters have been installed so that the impact of the initiative can be monitored and information can be fed back. I think in terms of that optimism, the advocates are also sounding more upbeat about the trial, but also trying to learn the lessons from some of what happened. And we thought it would be really interesting to talk through an example such as this in this event today, to get feedback and to just discuss some of the ideas that arise from this case study.
Great, thank you, Sian. So yeah, we picked this case study because it's an initiative which could reduce health inequalities. It's about urban planning and about improving health. But actually, when it comes to putting these things into practice, it's much more difficult. And sometimes the people who might be most expected to benefit from something like this are also some of the people that, for various reasons, might actually also be some of those people who are voicing some of the opposition that Sian's described. And situations like this are happening up and down the country. So we really want to have a discussion about how urban planners and people making strategic long-term decisions can work with communities to kind of address some of the issues that this case study highlights. And the first question we wanted to ask, and you can answer this question in the Mentimeter as well if you would like to, is what might be the motivations of different groups in this situation? And I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that we can see each other. But I was going to put that question initially to Joe and Victoria. So, Joe, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. What I'm going to do is actually I'm going to put the Menti up now. So the audience, you can go into Menti and actually put your comments up, which will come up on our screen as we're talking, so we can get some interaction feedback from you. So if you go to Menti and you have any comments while I'm speaking or afterwards, please share it. We want to hear your ideas. So I'm going to make a few observations and I'll pass over to Victoria, who's a public contributor on Trude. So in terms of motivations of different groups, examining the different groups in this situation, clearly some community members are highly motivated to reduce air pollution in their neighbourhoods, protect the health of their families and neighbours. It's not sort of air pollution, it's also safety, obviously, because there's speeding and accidents, as Sean mentioned. And so some community members will possibly also want to promote wider behaviour change amongst drivers and general public. And in some cases, they may even change their own personal habits and behaviour. So we could classify the Catch Rights Group as being able and willing to get involved and spend time working on the resident teams, which was set up as part of the initiative. So I think an important contrast can be made here between the motivation of this group, who possibly felt part of the decision that was taken and became actively involved in the scheme, or who were at least fully aware of it and felt able to embrace it, and those who felt they weren't properly consulted and that this initiative, they had the sense the initiative was sprung on them and imposed on them in some way. And so the latter group is likely to feel quite excluded from decision making and feel that new, potentially inconvenient changes are being forced upon them. And they may be motivated to protest locally, which actually happened, protest about the lack of consultation. And this motivation might also be built on an overall sense of not being heard in decisions which affect them in their local area. And that's why, as Sean mentioned, a long period of community-based dialogue and the idea of a time-limited trial with a detailed consultation process might actually be received more positively than a blanket decision. But it's really common, I mean, this is heard time and time again in such situations where local authorities detail how they've had engagement meetings, they put up posters, they've done leafleting in their local area about proposed changes, but still many residents will report that they don't know anything about the changes, and there's clearly some kind of disconnect going on engagement, which can lead to a lot of conflict and division, which can become quite inflamed. So this kind of flags the importance of early and consistent conversations through different entry points, and of making sure that information is provided in multiple languages for those for whom English isn't the first language, or targeting family and community members who can translate information from English into other languages. But I think for me, this also highlights a kind of simplistic, perhaps convenient idea of talking about a community. So badging something as community-led, as in this case, it suggests that everybody's on board and there's some sort of common voice and consensus. But we all know that in any given geographical area, there'll always be multiple communities with different needs, different priorities in their lives and different motivations. And some of these might not be very easy to reconcile. So while some community members might really feel the benefits of some new initiative outweigh the disadvantages, others really don't feel that. And some might feel that their already pressurized daily lives are being made much worse, like those who rely on driving for their livelihoods, for example. I know in a lot of cases there are a lot of taxi drivers who resisted these schemes, or those who have limited mobility or have alternative transport options. It all depends on the sort of structural setup, and the structural issues need to be recognised and addressed in some way to avoid increasing inequalities. The point Sean made in this case about gentrification resentment is interesting, because I'm kind of familiar with this context here in Bristol, where in an area, in a neighbourhood, there are likely to be quite stark inequalities in terms of income and health. And so as new residents move in and buy up properties and bring changes to an area, the longer term residents might have a sense of being unfairly impacted, and new costs have been brought to them through the changes introduced by the new incomes, if you like. And with the LTNs, the low traffic neighbourhoods, there'll also be people living on streets outside the scheme who may experience worse air pollution as drivers choose different routes, certain roads become thoroughfares, and this can exacerbate an already difficult situation. So ironically, the health of certain members of the population will be negatively impacted by measures which are ostensibly designed to protect health. So unless the overall traffic volume decreases as part of a wider programme, this is always going to be a touch paper for conflict between groups. And this is regularly reported at the moment all over the UK. The Daily Mail sees on this as a sort of running issue, and other news outlets as well. And I just want to also talk about motivations of other groups as well, like such as community organisations or local authority officials or elected councillors, and their urge to make positive changes and the pressures they might be under from different interest groups, and yet the challenges in developing consensus. In some of the research we've been doing in Trude, community organisation leads have described dilemmas they've faced when local community members protest against or reject schemes which on one level appear to have the potential to benefit their health, but they're actually rejected. So sort of questioning what is going on here. Is it the immediate pressures of people's everyday lives dominating their decision making here, and they're not embracing the changes that's offered? So those are my sort of preliminary points. So Victoria, would you like to share some of your thoughts now?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that, because reading through this case study, what really stood out to me was the group that are opposing the changes in the plans, and how that a lot of that seems like it is embedded in resentment, and it feels like it's more, the project becomes less about air pollution and improving the environment, and that's kind of overridden by the fact that these people in these areas that don't feel they have a voice, feel that they're overlooked and not listened to. So that was a real takeaway for me from that stood out, that the fact that people actually are pushing against something bigger than just air pollution and change.
I think that's an interesting point, Victoria. So do you think those things are part of a longer historical set of experiences rather than, so the actual thing itself is the touch paper, but it's actually a product of a lot longer history that people are reacting against?
Most definitely. I live myself in an area that's been gentrified, and even though the issues don't really bother me that much, but I know that there's people in my area that it does bother, and I think that not enough work is done on the ground prior to. I think a lot of gentrification is going on, and new communities are moving into areas with more resources, and they want to make changes to areas that have been deprived by local councils and organisations, and I think that there's not enough work done to actually integrate communities and to actually so then you have these changes, and actually we talk about the communities becoming divided, but I feel like the communities are already divided, and all that think that issues like this, when they come up, it just highlights that rather than creates it. Actually, there's something already going on underneath it all. Yeah,
thank you.
Andy, there's a really interesting comment there on the Menti about this, about what Victoria's just been talking about, this sort of creating a space for people to process their feelings, to express how things are affecting them.
Yeah, because that's another thing that I pulled out from it is time. People need time. Not everybody processes change at the same rate. And I think that people and communities need time to digest and to understand and to make changes. And I think, again, I think the level of engagement is a real issue, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, I think the engagement and the way people were engaged and the people that were lost in that, again, is an issue and is a contributing factor.
Thanks, Victor. And also that comment you made about gentrification, and also on the Menti, somebody said middle classes have more time and knowledge to influence public policy. So the sense that maybe some people have their voice heard more loudly in the debate than others.
Yeah, and I think that the issues, I used to work 12-hour shifts for very little, and I think at those times in my life that actually I didn't really care. That might sound to some people like quite ignorant, but it was the last thing on my mind, what my environment was like, what the air pollution was like. And I think for a lot of people that, and as well, that access to the information, like I've learned a lot coming on board with Trud, but like before that, there wasn't, there's not as much access to that information unless you're looking for it.
Thank you, Victoria. And there's also some interesting comments about should the pre-planning have sort of taken account of some of these issues and engaged at an earlier time, and the early stage of the project is where the mistakes were made. But should we move on to the second question, because I know we have got limited time, and there's one question we could spend such a long time talking about. But the next question is, how can we navigate differences of opinion? And Kelvin, could you kick us off on this one, please?
Yes, I think I'm just going to raise probably a whole load of more questions, really. about how we navigate these differences of opinion. I mean, for me, I've sort of been both involved in projects where we have had community involvement when I was a councillor in Knoll West, and we've had lots of different voices involved in development and regeneration schemes, for instance, where actually, there's lots of community events and the rest of it. And I've also been involved with political campaigns that have sort of, in a way, highlighted the differences. In just before 2016 election here in Bristol, we exploited, I think, the sort of sense that the previous mayor had implemented lots of schemes and not listened to people, and we kind of exploited that fact. So I think sometimes politics can be detrimental to the kind of easing these types of schemes forward. But looking at this case study, I mean, I think that everyone will see a project in their communities or in their cities that actually reflect those types of initiatives. And for me, it's kind of interesting that how do we get to a situation where we can be quite near to implementation, and then all of a sudden we get a whole load of voices against the particular proposal. And I think it's about investing in good consultation and try to get as many wide voices involved in the schemes early on, because often, my experience, when we've come forward with schemes, there's been a lot of organizational kind of capital spent on those schemes, the working up of them, and often officers, of the council are sort of, are kind of embedded and engaged in the successful implementation of them. So often, they have quite a lot of capital invested, and I think at that point, when the public see it, whether it's a scheme that goes to planning, and it's at the very last minute, you get a lot of opposition at that point. You then get this sort of them and us. So I think for us, how we navigate that is, I think, being much better, bringing this back, bringing communities in at a much earlier stage of the process, and try to have as wide a consultation as possible. For me, though, is that living in cloud cuckoo land in today's world where councils have been disinvested? 10 years between 2010 and 2020, £3 in every 4 were taken out of council funding, and a lot of the additional staff within councils across the country were community development staff, were the people that were doing the kind of outreach. So now perhaps we need to have a look at how we kind of invest in councils and what we invest in. I think I mean, I was looking at an example just recently in Knoll West, area where I grew up in. There's a proposal for 47 houses. It went to planning. It got approved at planning committee, 3 votes to 2, with 2 abstentions and 90 objections from community members and people not happy about the development. It's interesting how we could kind of all agree on the concept about affordable housing, right, and what the need for affordable housing. But when the sort of rubber hits the road, right, when we have the actual applications on our doorstep, all of a sudden we don't want it here. So how can we manage that? I mean, for me, strong political leadership or clear political leadership is great on one hand, but on another, that's arrogance, and it's kind of not listening, and it's kind of not involving. So there is a balance to be struck. But I was definitely interested in what our audience members got to kind of what their views about the solutions to these things. I mean, for me, it's about listening. It's about being open-minded and not coming to these proposals, where everything is sort of, stitched up and ready to go.
Thanks, Calvin. That's really helpful. That's really interesting. And I think there's a couple of comments here about trust. I think that's a key issue, because I suspect that the people who experience the worst health inequalities have also got the lowest levels of trust. And I also think that comment there about establishing, actually, you only talk to communities when you want something from us, and that comment about establishing a conversation anyway, so that you've developed a relationship rather than just building one when you kind of want something out of it.
Well, let me come back to that. I mean, look, right. So when I growing up 30 years ago in Knoll West, the health inequalities between Knoll West in the south of Bristol and Clifton was 9 years difference between life expectancy. today it's 8 years. So if you imagine, like, still to the detriment in Knowle West, but so you could say that all the public policy interventions that we've had over that time, what real difference has it made? And I think these working class estates and councils often see new schemes as that they needed to sort of defend the status quo because they do have that lack of trust. And there is a sort of concept that sort of people, advisors or sort of middle class and kind of a sort of a difference of opinion with people that have working lives and have busy working lives. So there is big differences essentially to kind of get over, and sometimes political leadership can do that when we have a clear, compelling reason for doing stuff, and also be able to have sort of listen to the public as you go forward, but still making
great. Thank
progress.
you. And there's an interesting chat about in the Mentimeter about maybe it's about seeing that people aren't looking for different things, but they're coming at things from different angles and different ways. And maybe that also fits with the first point as well about how we might overcome some of the problems.
Can I just add something about what Kelvin was saying about resources and having to resource this engagement process? Because something I've learned on Truth that's quite surprised me, I suppose, maybe I was a bit naive, was how local councils talk about they haven't got the money to pay for engagement because they've got a very limited budget. It makes you question, really, doesn't it? I mean, that if you understanding that, make you wonder about trust as well, really, doesn't it? About if you're not willing to invest and put some resources into that early stage, then what do you do if you haven't got money to do it? I don't know where the money's going. You have a limited budget. You have to decide how to allocate it. But of course, these engagement activities cost, and it depends how you manage them as well. Whether you do it yourself in-house or you bring in consultants to do it, which is another question about contracting it. But yeah, the thing about resources and investment in those conversations and engagement with communities, I think is quite an interesting one.
I mean, overall, does it really matter, right? Because ultimately, if we get schemes on the ground that make a difference, and actually the evidence is that often, the public after a scheme has been implemented are much less against it than when they are before. Does it really matter? Is it best that we sort of move forward and get on with these schemes? So that's just, I pose that as a question rather than come to a conclusion.
Thanks, Kelvin. And we do have to move on, I'm afraid. But I think, and it's coming out in some more posts and some in the chat as well, about this need to create a space where different voices are on an equal footing, and this kind of equal participation and parity between different voices, I think, is coming out quite strongly. But I'm going to move on now to the last question. The last question is, what are the lessons that we need to learn from these kinds of experiences? And I'm going to go to Sian as the person who sort of kicked us off with this case study to kick off this part of the discussion.
Okay, well, I said some general things about what had been learned in that small locality, but I just wanted to add some more context to this by talking about what was being done on more of a policy level. And to talk about getting the framework right, really. You'll notice that I highlighted that councillors were, had uneven access to information, that there was differences in access to information, within the locality. Trust has been mentioned. Access to information has been mentioned. So I just wanted to point out, what the situation is in GM. That there's been a shift towards active travel that's been in development for 15 years. That Greater Manchester has a cycling and walking commissioner. So this is about creating, promoting active travel across the conurbation. Over a very long period, and that is seen as being part of what needs to happen. So there's a general raising in level of awareness around the need for introducing some of these initiatives, even though we accept that when it actually comes to developing on what some people call kind of a hyper-local level or the neighbourhood level, that you still come across some of these problems. So I think in GM it's very much about engaging people. There's an initiative called GM Moving, which is trying to focus on projects which are helping people to shift towards walking and cycling, tackling this 30% of journeys that's done in that's less than 1 kilometre. But there's also a strategy which has just been signed off called Streets for All. And Streets for All is interesting in that it tries to balance all the different needs of people that use streets, and to recognise that there are different uses for streets, and that people who need to do deliveries, people who need to move across the city, need to use the key routes, and that's important too, that the economy is important too, and that is recognised. So it's not ignoring the needs of people who need to move around. It's about saying, it's about developing something which Greater Manchester are calling the right mix. It's saying that, you know, people do need to be able to move around, but, you know, when journeys are short, then we need to provide people with alternatives. And that's the next aspect, perhaps, is that quite a lot of the objections and the motivations that people have they're saying, well, you've stopped me going down my road, but there's no bus, or the bus is 3 times as expensive as if I take my car. So, you know, how do we create an integrated transport system that encourages people to engage in active travel? So we're not just putting planters in the way and stopping people moving around. We're actually also connecting people to good quality and affordable public transport. So the B network, which has been devised, which will cover the whole of Greater Manchester, as an infrastructure approach, incorporates buses and trams, and is hoping to be up and running by 2024. There's presently 108 schemes, 500 million pounds worth of infrastructure that's in the pipeline. So really, you know, putting those alternatives front and centre to the project, not just taking access away. There are 17 active neighbourhood schemes, and one of the things that I think is interesting is that there's a continuous process of consultation. If you look on the B Network website, there's a whole list of consultation events. The consultation's permanently open. You can also access personalised maps, so you can put your postcode in, you can have a look at what's going on in your neighbourhood at any point in time. That investment, isn't it, in terms of alternatives, but also in terms of the walking and cycling infrastructure, that there's a real emphasis on making sure that that's of good quality and offers a good alternative. So I think just in terms of lessons and how it kind of connects, it's about information, it's about providing alternatives to people, about having a continuous process of consultation and buy-in, and making sure that what is delivered and developed is of good quality, and takes into account all the different uses of the road space.
Thank you, Sian. And there's a few comments in the Mentimeter. So I'd like this comment about someone's put about having a really compelling vision for change up front so that everybody can engage with, but then also doing the listening. So you've got that 2 sides to it. You've got a clear drive to a particular objective, but then how you get there, maybe you discuss with people. And I think the point that you raised also about having an alternative, if you think about London works. A lot of people don't use cars in London, but that is because there is an alternative system to use. And there's also some comments about the need to get everybody on board, and also that maybe sometimes it's some of the voices that we hear maybe quite unrepresentative, particularly in this age of social media, where you're a relatively small group of people can make a lot of noise. And there's some more things about creating welcoming spaces. And then also, if there's anybody in the group, anybody in the audience who's experienced these kinds of problems and has got some suggestions about how we cope with them, please put them up. Does anybody else on the panel want to reflect on what's been said by Sian or what's happening on the things that have been raised in the Mentimeter?
Can I just make a comment about the consultations online not being accessible to everyone? Because I think sometimes this idea that you allow people to, there is a space for people to put, online to make comments and feedback. But I think that's a really important point. And I think that has been taken on board now in some of the new stuff happening in Bristol, realising that there needs to be further more work done to sort of reach out to different members of the community who won't not necessarily not able to get online. There is a digital divide as well. We know that, but also haven't really possibly got time or have to sort of seek it out to do it, and that's just gets too complicated. You need to actually go out and find those voices yourself. Like somebody else has put in the mention about the silent majority, the silent groups that have no voice, that aren't heard at all at the moment.
Yeah. So that really comes back to this kind of idea of outreach as well, doesn't it? Because when I mentioned that you could see online where the consultations were, I meant that the events, it was publicising the events that were taking place. But, we also need to think that, people don't necessarily have the time and the inclination to turn up to events, and that, there's a role probably there for counsellors as well, isn't there, to kind of be able to feed into the process and to be connected with their communities. I don't know if Kelvin's got anything to say on that.
Well, I might just say that these things are difficult, right? They're never going to be straightforward. I think what you need is tenacity, but open sense of kind of listening and ability to kind of be responsive, but have a sort of, ironically, a sense of humour, right, and a kind of humility about these things. I think what's difficult is when people get into fixed positions and then they end up having quite sort of disparate conversations about it. So for me, actually, nothing. I can't see any of these sort of schemes ever coming forward and being straightforward. But actually pushing forward with that, is the most important thing, because we know that ultimately, the benefits that these types of schemes bring far outweigh the sort of opposition that they tend to generate.
Yes, can I just say, I really like that comment about being forthcoming with information, including community members in the research and exploration, so it's a shared journey, because that's something came up in my neighbourhood about air pollution and the local MP wanting to put in air pollution monitors, and never actually happened, especially near schools, because I think sometimes we're not aware of the actual danger that's all around us, and it's through that collecting evidence and data and actually understanding what we're collecting and what it means. Maybe that's a sense of creating consensus around the problem, because all this sort of mistrust of evidence and experts nowadays, isn't there? So this thing about, I love that idea about being part of the exploration, the shared journey, and in some sense it's true just trying to do that in some ways with the research we're doing with communities.
And Victoria, have you got any thoughts about the comments that from your point of view as somebody who's lived in a community, who lives in a community that's affected by these issues? You're on mute, by the way. No worries. You're still on mute. So that's it.
Yeah. No. Yes, it's taking me off now. I think possibly touching on the point of, again, that thing about, not everyone's going to agree, and I get that. And it isn't going to be easy because you've got all these different kind of ideas and people looking at it from different angles. But I think that a more together and a more cohesive community means that then when disappointments come up, when things don't go people's way, then people are a little bit more open to, they take the blow a little bit easier. Do you know what I mean? Because there's that mutual respect, and there's that kind of, they've had an opportunity to be heard, they've had an opportunity to be to get the voice, the points across.
I was just going to say, I think when you're in a community that's lost a lot, and some of the lowest income communities have lost a lot over the last 10 years with austerity, losing something else seems like a big issue, even though it might not seem a lot to other people. But I think when you've lost a lot already, losing a little bit more is actually quite difficult to cope with. And again, I'd be interested to see what people would like to say in the Mentimeter, but how we feed some of these kinds of issues that we're discussing today to the people who make the strategic decisions in a way that actually has some impact, I think is a really important issue. I don't know if anybody on the panel has got some thoughts about that. And then the other question that occurred to me about the digital divide, is it also the way we design these things? If these things are like apps on your phone that sat alongside your your other social media, would people use them? It's, whereas if you've got to log onto a website and so on. But anyway, there's just a couple of questions I'll just jump in.
I was going to say, I think we need to be a bit more creative in how we engage with people, and I think that these, especially with like stuff like community consultations and things like that. I think posting letters through, people's doors, online consultations. But I think these other ways that you can get people involved in the whole process, and I like that. I think was it Kelvin that was saying about. Sorry, it's gone. But yeah, I think we need to think more creatively of how we get people involved, how we bring people together. To create a better landscape for these conversations.
And that's interesting because there's a point that someone's just made about having, different ways of communicating. Sort of that someone's just posted in a Mentimeter, which kind of fits in with that.
And the language is important as well. And I don't mean just mean people different, like people that don't speak English. Also the language that's used as well. Sometimes I do it myself. You know what I mean. And all kinds of people with learning disabilities and things like that, they need to be communicated with different ways. It definitely needs a more blended approach.
Yeah, definitely. And I like this. So there's another comment here: advisors on tap, not on top, which I think is a nice way of summing it up. Advisors on tap, not on top. I don't know. Did anybody want to comment about any of that?
Yeah, I mean, that was. I mean, when I was a councillor in Knoll West, Mary Smith come up with that phrase. It's really important that actually the community feel like they're kind of involved, and rather than sort of an army of people coming in to tell them what essentially needs to be done. Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a comment in the Nicolette's put something in the chat. You were saying that experience suggests that you can get a lot of virulent opposition. But actually that can be overcome once the scheme's implemented.
Yeah.
So
that was my point. Yeah, that was my point about kind of, does it really matter sometimes? Do we need to be brave, and just kind of plough ahead, even though there's sometimes fierce opposition? I mean, interestingly enough, in the opposition there was to these 47 houses in Knoll West, I saw people on a Facebook group that lived in Cornwall now, grew up in Knoll West, lived in Cornwall, and were moaning about the loss of green space in Knoll West. It's quite interesting how sort of social media, because kind of people can congregate and be quite vicious on social media, but actually outside, if you have a normal conversation with them, you end up, actually kind of having a better conversation rather than the sort of keyboard warrior type of approach that we get on social media sometimes.
So there is this issue, and there's there's an interesting tension in the discussion that we've had, and it's reflected in the Mentimeter thing between the notion of the silent majority and also pressing on despite opposition and having a bit of bravery versus we need to do lots of listening and engaging. So I think maybe that person who made a comment about having a clear vision, but combining that with listening is the way you combine those two oppositions, because it can feel quite hard. How do you pull together this political leadership bravery versus listening?
Yes.
But maybe that comment about having a clear vision and listening is what we need. I can see some nodding.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, understanding the compelling reason for change, that's people conceptually can sign up to that, and it's then saying, look, there's some compromises that we need to do on the ground to enable that to happen.
Yeah. So there's more comments coming up. So we are coming towards the end of the session. So I don't know if anybody, and Sean, we've got a last slide that I think you were going to talk to us. I can pull that up in a minute if you just to warn you. But before we finish, does anybody want to make any last comments about the discussion, either in response to what other people on the panel have said or what's popping up in the Mentimeter?
Just one thing about one of the comments that's come up, and I think it's comes up all the time in public engagement, is the timing of it, I suppose, the timing of the conversation. So decisions haven't been taken, but the idea is evolving. At what stage you actually start having those conversations, so people actually feel they're part of that journey, I suppose.
Yeah, and that kind of does mean that politicians have to give up a bit of power sometimes. Yeah, so and that's always a challenging thing.
Yeah, and there's an interesting comment about pop-up engagement, sort of street level engagement, which that's something that's been done in Manchester, or anybody's got any experience of.
I'm not sure what I'm not sure what's meant by that. What?
I think it's about when you're doing what kind of engagement activities do. The sort of classic ones might be a public meeting or leafleting. Pop-up thing is right. You might take up a space in the community and be sitting there and engage people. That could be quite creatively and having conversations. So it's a pop-up thing. I know that in Bristol, with some of the new residential developments, they're trying to take on board some of these ideas and experiment with lots of different ways of reaching out to different members of the community at different times of day in different places. I mean, even door knocking is one option, but I mean, it's this thing about how do you have an engagement activity that brings the voices of many different groups together, so you can take them on board.
So I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, Victoria. You don't have to if you don't want to. I'm not putting you on the spot. So what I'm going to do then, Sian, I'm going to put this last slide up if you're happy to finish up. So we've got about 4 minutes left. And thank you everybody who's contributed stuff in the chat and also the stuff that's in the Mentimeter. We'll keep all this and use this and carry on posting, by the way, because if you've got any links or work that you're doing that we could learn from, we're really pleased to hear from you. But I'm just going to put up this last slide now and we'll bring this part to a close. So let me just remember how to share my screen. So it's telling me that I can't do that for some reason. You got a second. Oh, no, that's the wrong thing. Sorry about this. Sian, have you got that slide? Because
I can. I've got it.
Yeah, I'm just struggling to find. Yeah, can you?
Yeah. So this was us just really thinking through what some of the lessons were before we, had the feedback and had the discussion. But it's interesting that there are similarities between what's been discussed and what the what participants have flagged up and what we had previously identified. The first one was really about thinking through the role of the community and the role of the council and getting the balance of responsibility right there, so that the community don't get the blame, but the council can take some responsibility, but also that the council can take more responsibility for good quality consultation, can take more responsibility for sharing information. The community doesn't have to take kind of responsibility for that, but can get but could be better involved if the council can approach it differently. So we talked quite a bit about that, didn't we, in the role of councillors. The second point was around consultation and communication and what the experience of low traffic neighbourhoods and the trials are, and just this balance I think that Kelvin was touching on there between getting everybody on board and actually just embarking on the experiment and having the trial and letting people experience some of what might come about as a result of making changes, and how that can actually affect people's understanding as well. There was the third point is the ability to adapt decisively, but to maintain the overall objective. What we've noticed is that in some of the more successful schemes is that it's okay to change tack if you've put a planter, say, on a particular street and that isn't working out. If you're continuously getting feedback, you can move it, you can adjust, and it seems that the councils that have taken that kind of approach, where they've adjusted the project as they've been going along, responding to feedback in real time, have been more successful than perhaps the ones that have panicked and just taken everything down. We talked about how one lesson was around how councillors needed accurate local knowledge, information, and also needed support to build confidence, perhaps from the experience of other councillors who'd kind of weathered this storm. The fifth lesson was around the role of social media and the kind of underlying social social equality issues, that it's important not to be that social media can play a role, but it can also amplify voices that and that we still need to consider the silent majority, and really need to consider the people that we are supposed to be supporting and helping in tackling health inequality. And then the final lesson that we had on our slide was, should challenges encountered be accepted as part of the learning process, or could they have been avoided? How could they be avoided in future? And this were the sorts of questions that we've been talking about here, really. And I think that, from what I've heard is, we know that there are ways in which consultation and engagement can improve. If we can concentrate on the right people at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way, but perhaps that we can't avoid confrontation and the challenges altogether, and then there's ways in which we can mitigate against some of the issues. So I think that was what was on the slide.
Thank you for that, because that saved me getting embarrassed trying to click back on that. Thank you. Yeah, and it does fit a little bit, but yeah, I think that what's good about this is there are difficulties, but there's been a lot of solutions suggested about how we cope with it. And thank you to our speakers. Kelvin's disappeared, but I know Kelvin's still in the session, and to Victoria and to Joe and to Sian. Thank you extremely very much. And also to everybody who's contributed via the chat and by the Mentimeter. That's been really great. In fact, I'm going to finish off with a comment in the chat from Nicolette, which says, I think you need a compelling overarching vision that is shared and which is co-created with diverse stakeholders. And I think that's quite a nice summary of what's been said. But yes, thank you everybody for your participation. And it's time for a break now, get some lunch, have a drink and whatever. And the next session will begin back here at 1 o'clock. So yeah, but thank you to everybody. That was really, really enjoyable and really interesting. Thank you. Bye.